All right. So our next story comes from yet another vendor. It's Horizon.ai, their blog, and the title here is "Critical or Clickbait: GitHub Actions and Apache Tomcat RCE Vulnerabilities in 2025." This is similar to another story we have a little bit later, but the overarching theme here is that both of these vulnerabilities were treated by the security industry as super critical.
Mm-hmm.
The GitHub Security Actions one got lots of press. It didn't have a named, like it wasn't on like Good Morning America. It wasn't at that level
There was no mascot, no theme song.
yeah, none of that
There,
stuff.
there should have been.
There should have been. I agree, but it did get a lot of press and caused a lot of work, a lot of reaction, a lot of investigation. Similar on the Tomcat vulnerability. It was a remote code execution bug, and that drove lots of activity. What this article is talking about is that while both of those on their surface were very critical, when you look under the covers, neither of them were actually meaningfully exploited. So, with the GitHub Actions as an example, they found that despite it having been active on thousands of repos, they actually only found one instance where the credentials were leaked. And in that instance, they were able to confirm that no one actually accessed the credentials. And so it was like a tree fell in the woods. No one heard it. And then the Tomcat scenario said that the vulnerable configuration required is not default and was in their research actually not provisioned anywhere. They couldn't find any instances of that vulnerable configuration on the internet. So I don't know like if that's a timing thing. So did everybody patch before this company went off and did their survey or not? But the overarching point here is that we have to do a better job of prioritizing what we focus our limited amount of attention on, and it's not always the things that get the biggest headlines. That's, I think, is the kind of the key takeaway, at least what
No,
they're
you're
trying
right.
to make it a takeaway.
Well, on the TJ Actions one, this was only in place for a short period of time, and it did get a lot of press. So it's possible that it had flown under the radar for longer. Code check ins using that action would have happened, and more passwords would have potentially been dumped. So you might be able to make the argument that the widespread press and awareness campaign short circuited the ability for this to be truly harmful, potentially. The other problem is when you're talking to your executive and they're waving this article in front of you saying, do we have this in our environment? What are we doing about it? You're right that this may not be the most pressing thing, but it's very difficult, unfortunately, in that scenario to tell your CISO or whatever, I've got bigger fish to fry. But this is in the news and it's the new shiny.
I think the other issue is that, like so many things in security, it's obvious in hindsight, right? Like if you're one of the customers or entities that were using the TJ actions and the vulnerable TJ action, like you didn't have the information that nobody's actually harmed by this at that time. Like you have to go do the work
Mm-hmm.
to find out that you weren't impacted. And so, like to some extent, I fully agree with the premise of the article, but I think the challenge where I struggle with it is that it's only obvious in hindsight, because at the time, you have the fog of war problem. You don't know. And so on the Tomcat issue, I think it's maybe a little bit different, because when that vulnerability was published, it was also disclosed, what the vulnerable configuration was. And so it's not unreasonable to say, I don't have that configuration in my environment.
Mm-hmm.
But even there, you think you don't have that configuration in
Right.
your.
And I know from our friend Bob was telling me that some of his tools flagged it, and then when they investigated it, it turned out to not actually be vulnerable. So then you've got issues like that. The other flip side on a well broadcast issue is how many script kiddies then start going after it that wouldn't have otherwise. So there's this whole game theory going on here of what begets what and what leads on to what. You're almost damned if you do, damned if you don't. But I agree with you. Typically chasing the shiny that's in the news is probably not your best win. But we have got in this cycle that I don't know how to break out of.